All right, so are you ready for a deep dive?
Always.
Well, today we're looking at a case that's pretty fascinating and honestly a little unsettling.
Sounds right up our alley.
It is, it is. We're going to be looking at Willie Ben Jones, a convicted serial killer from Richmond, Virginia.
Okay. And what about him?
Well, the really unsettling part is that he is scheduled to be released from prison on December 24th, 2025.
Wow, so Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
That's definitely a cause for concern, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you think about, what he did and the fact that this isn't, some really old cold case.
Right. This is a story that is very much still unfolding.
Exactly.
So today we're going to be using a Wikipedia article to unpack all the details of this case. Try to understand what led to these crimes, how Jones was eventually caught, and, what his potential release could mean.
It's a heavy one for sure.
It is. I was actually reading through this article you sent me, and
Yeah.
did you know that he almost got away with one of his murders?
Yeah, there are a lot of twists and turns in this story. But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics.
Okay, sounds good.
So Willie Ben Jones was born in 1953, making him 71 or 72 years old today. And he was convicted of murdering at least 3 sex workers in Richmond.
And this all took place between 1980 and 1991.
That's right.
And I don't know if you saw this, but I thought it was really chilling. He actually admitted to his motive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the article states that he said he believed that sex workers had to be punished.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a very disturbing worldview, to say the least.
It's like he just decided to appoint himself judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah, there's definitely some unsettling ideology there driving those actions. So you want to go through the timeline of his crimes?
Yeah, let's go through it. I mean, I was reading through it, and it's just really disturbing, some of the specifics.
Right. Well, the first murder that's linked to Jones happened on October 6, 1980. The victim was 31-year-old Ronald Jones, who was a cross-dresser. It seems that Willie Ben Jones picked up Ronald, and when he realized that Ronald was a man, he fatally stabbed him.
Oh, gosh.
And he left the body behind his apartment building.
That's just awful.
Then, a little over a year later, on November 19th, 1981, he struck again. He strangled 24-year-old Miranda Zimmerman after they got into an argument.
Is there any information about what the argument was about?
Unfortunately, no, this Wikipedia article doesn't give us those specific details.
Okay.
Or like how he chose his victims or anything like that. But it does mention a 9-year gap between this murder and his next known victim.
9 years? Wow. That's a really significant amount of time.
It is.
Makes you wonder what he was doing during those years.
Yeah.
And if there were potentially other victims out there who haven't been, connected to him.
Right. And that's one of the big challenges that investigators face when dealing with serial killers, right?
Right.
They operate in the shadows, and their crimes can go undetected for years, sometimes even decades.
That's a terrifying thought. Now, the article also mentions that Jones actually confessed to another murder, that of a 33-year-old Priscilla Louise Leeper in 1988.
Okay.
But for some reason that isn't really explained. He was never prosecuted for that crime. Why would he confess and then not be held accountable?
Yeah, good question. That's a question that's probably puzzled investigators for years. Maybe there wasn't enough evidence to support his confession, like physical evidence, or maybe there were issues with how they got the confession.
Oh, okay, so maybe it was inadmissible in court.
Right, exactly. It's really hard to know for sure
Right.
without, access to all the official case files. But his eventual capture, that came about in a very bizarre way.
Okay, I'm all ears. How was he finally caught?
So in November of 1990, Jones just walked into a police station in Northern Virginia and confessed to 4 murders.
Okay.
But here's the unbelievable part.
What?
They didn't arrest him.
He confessed to 4 murders and they let him walk out the door.
I know, it's unbelievable. And the article doesn't explain why.
Wow.
Maybe they didn't believe him, or maybe there was some kind of miscommunication. Who knows? But Jones was determined to be caught. So he walked into FBI headquarters and confessed again.
Wow, talk about a bold move. It's like he wanted to get caught.
Right.
So what happened at his trial?
So during the trial, a Richmond detective named Steve A. Dalton quoted Jones as saying that his victims had to be punished.
Oh,
which just cemented his motive in the prosecution's case. In the end, Jones pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder.
So he admitted to the crimes, but not to first-degree murder?
Right.
What's the difference?
So in Virginia, first-degree murder has to be premeditated, planned in advance.
Oh, okay.
Second degree is more like an intentional killing that wasn't planned. Seems like maybe the prosecution had trouble proving premeditation, or maybe they just offered him a plea deal to avoid a long, drawn-out trial.
Okay, that makes sense. So what was his sentence?
He got 60 years.
60 years. Wow, essentially a life sentence.
Yeah, 20 years for each count. But it's not quite that simple.
What do you mean?
Initially, he was ineligible for parole because of Virginia's three-strikes law.
Oh, right, which basically means harsher sentences for repeat offenders.
Exactly. But when he turned 60, he became eligible for something called geriatric parole.
Geriatric parole, what is that?
Yeah, it's a special type of parole specifically for older inmates. The thinking is that after a certain age, they pose a lower risk to public safety. It may not be cost-effective or even humane to keep them locked up.
So has Willie Ben Jones ever been granted this geriatric parole?
He's actually been up for review several times since becoming eligible, but he's been denied every time.
Okay.
However, his scheduled release date is still December 24th, 2025, unless something changes.
Wow, this is already a lot to unpack.
It is.
And we're just getting started. We've got a serial killer who targets sex workers, a weird double confession, and an upcoming release date.
This deep dive's getting pretty intense.
It is. And I think what makes this even more complex is that it brings up so many questions about how we as a society view crime and punishment.
Right. It's not just about Willie Ben Jones and what he did. It's about us, our collective responsibility, the choices we make, and how those choices affect everyone.
Exactly. And it makes us think about some honestly really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems that, we've created. So what are some of the questions that this case raises for you?
Well, for me, it boils down to this. How do we balance justice and accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation? Can someone like Willie Ben Jones, with his history of violence and, that disturbing justification, can he truly be rehabilitated? And if so, what would that look like?
I mean, those are big questions. I don't think there are any easy answers.
No, definitely not.
But I'm glad we're talking about it.
Me too.
Because with his release date coming up so soon, it's a conversation that we need to be having.
I agree. And I think it's really important to remember that this isn't just some philosophical dilemma.
Yeah.
It's about real people and real lives that have been impacted by these crimes.
And it's about the very real possibility of, future harm. And we haven't even gotten into the fact that Jones almost got away with Priscilla Leeper's murder.
Right.
What does that say about the criminal justice system, and the fact that there's always the potential for mistakes and oversights?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's definitely something that we should explore further.
Yeah. I mean, the possibility of undetected victims, the reasons why he was released that first time after he confessed, all these things deserve a closer look.
Agreed. There's so much more to uncover here. But for now, let's take a step back and just consider the bigger picture. What are the wider implications of this case for the legal system and for society?
Well, I think one of the most important things is the focus on sex workers as victims. This case highlights how vulnerable they are and the dangers that they face.
Right.
And, the attitudes that they often encounter from law enforcement and just from society in general.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in, the whole sensationalism of a serial killer case.
Right.
That we forget about the actual human beings at the heart of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, these are women with lives and families and dreams, and, their stories deserve to be heard and respected.
I completely agree. And, this case also makes us think about the role of prejudice and biases and how criminal behavior takes shape.
Like, did Jones's views on sex workers contribute to his actions? Right, exactly. Did he think he could get away with these crimes because of who his victims were? These are tough questions, but we have to consider them if we want to understand why violence happens and how to prevent it from happening again.
You've raised some really good points. It seems like there are so many layers to this case, so many different threads.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down the rabbit hole, let's shift our focus to Jones's upcoming release.
Okay.
What are some of the things that the parole board will be thinking about when they decide whether or not to grant him freedom?
That's a great question, and that takes us right to the heart of the whole debate about rehabilitation and public safety.
Right. So let's dig into that and try to understand all the different sides of this case. Where do we even begin?
I think it's important to acknowledge that the parole board has a very difficult decision to make.
Right.
They have to balance the risk of letting someone like Jones out with the idea of rehabilitation, which, is a cornerstone of our justice system.
Yeah, they're kind of walking a tightrope, aren't they? One wrong step and the consequences could be devastating.
Yeah, for sure. So they have to think about things like Jones's age and his health, how he's been behaving in prison,
Right.
um, if he's had any therapy or treatment.
Okay.
And the big one, does he seem genuinely sorry for what he did?
Yeah, does he even understand the severity of his actions?
Right, exactly.
The article did mention that he's been denied parole multiple times.
Yeah.
So what do you think were the main reasons for those decisions?
It's hard to know for sure. We don't know exactly what goes on in those parole board meetings.
Right.
But it's probably safe to assume that his motive,
Yeah.
that those women had to be punished, that probably played a big role.
Right.
That combined with how brutal his crimes were,
Yeah.
it just makes it seem like he could still be a danger to society.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if some crimes are so, I don't know, just so awful that a person can never really be rehabilitated.
Hmm.
Like, can someone like Willie Ben Jones truly change?
That's a big question,
Yeah.
One that's been around for a long time. Is there a point where someone's just too far gone, where they just need to be kept away from society for good? There are no easy answers to those questions.
It's a very gray area.
Yeah.
What also makes this case so complicated is that Jones targeted sex workers, people who are, very often marginalized and overlooked by society. Do you think that played a role in him thinking he could get away with these crimes?
That's definitely possible. Unfortunately, when the victims are from marginalized groups, their cases often don't get the same attention,
Right.
or the same level of public outrage.
Yeah.
And maybe even not the same justice.
Yeah, it's like there's a perception that these victims are somehow less deserving of protection.
Yeah, and that can make perpetrators feel like they can get away with it, and it creates this climate of impunity.
Yeah.
It's really a tragic reality that needs to change.
Absolutely. And it makes you realize that this is not just about one man and the crimes he committed. It's about bigger issues.
Right.
Like systemic biases and how we as a society often fail to protect those who are the most vulnerable.
Yeah, it really forces us to look at our own prejudices,
Yeah,
and how they might be contributing to these cycles of violence.
absolutely. So going back to Jones and his potential release, if the parole board does decide to grant him parole,
Yeah.
what kind of help would he get to try and, make sure he doesn't commit these crimes again?
Well, that's where reintegration comes in. Ideally, there'd be a really comprehensive plan in place for him. Things like help finding a place to live, job training, maybe counseling for substance abuse,
Yeah.
mental health support.
Okay.
Basically, trying to help him get back on his feet and live a normal, law-abiding life.
It sounds like it would take a lot of work, a lot of resources to make that happen.
Right.
But isn't that kind of the whole point of rehabilitation?
Yeah.
Like to give people a second chance, try and break that cycle of crime, make our communities safer.
In theory, yeah, that's the goal. But unfortunately, a lot of these programs don't get enough funding. They're just overwhelmed and can't really meet the needs of all the people they're trying to help. And with a case like this,
Yeah.
where the crimes were so bad and his motives are so disturbing, there's going to be a lot of fear and doubt from the public.
Yeah, for sure. It must be so hard to balance that idea of giving someone a second chance with the very real fear that they might hurt someone else.
Yeah, and I think that's something we all have to wrestle with,
Right.
not just as a society, but as individuals too.
Right.
Do we prioritize punishment, just keeping someone locked up,
Mm.
or do we believe that people can actually change?
Even after doing terrible things.
Right, even after that.
It doesn't feel like there's one right answer.
There isn't. It's a tough situation with a lot of moral dilemmas.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that needs to be happening everywhere, not just in the courts, but,
Right.
in our families, our communities.
Yeah.
We all need to be talking about this. One thing that I keep coming back to is the victims and their families.
Right.
What happens to them in all of this?
Yeah.
Do they even have a voice?
Well, that's a really important point, one that often gets forgotten.
Yeah.
Victim impact statements, where they can talk about how these crimes have affected them.
Yeah.
That's a key part of the parole process.
I can't even imagine what it must be like for them to know that this person who, took so much from them might be getting out.
It's incredibly difficult for them.
Does the parole board even consider their statements when they make their decision?
Yes, they're legally obligated to consider it. But, at the end of the day, it's a really complicated decision. They have to think about the risk, the potential for rehabilitation, and public safety. So it's hard to say for sure.
Right. It's a lot for everyone to deal with. They have to live with this long after the news stops talking about it and the legal stuff is all over.
Their trauma doesn't just go away, and they still deserve justice and healing.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these crimes have a ripple effect that goes way beyond just the immediate act.
Exactly.
It's important that their voices are heard and that they are not forgotten in this process.
Yeah, their perspective is incredibly valuable as we're trying to figure out these complicated issues.
Absolutely. So as we keep digging into this case,
Yeah.
let's remember that we're talking about real people, real lives that have been affected by violence,
Right.
and the system that's always struggling to find that balance between punishment and rehabilitation, accountability and forgiveness.
And within that balance lies the core of this case and really the essence of how we try to achieve justice.
Now, we've talked a lot about the potential risks of letting Willie Ben Jones out.
Yeah.
But what about the other side of things? Are there reasons why the parole board might think that he's not a danger anymore?
That's a good question, and it's really important to consider all sides of this. Some people might say that after spending so much time in prison, he served his time, paid his debt to society. Others might point to his age, his health, maybe as reasons to believe he's not the same person anymore.
I mean, it's definitely possible for people to change,
Right.
grow and learn from their past. But is that enough in a case like this? How do we know if someone's truly rehabilitated?
That's the million-dollar question.
It really is.
Is it about feeling remorse? Is it about changing your behavior? Is it about trying to make up for what you did?
Yeah, those are all good questions. So what does the parole board look for?
They really have to look at everything. Any signs of genuine remorse? Is he willing to take responsibility for his actions?
Right.
Is he committed to living a life that's within the law? They'll also look at how he's been behaving in prison. Has he participated in any rehabilitation programs and any psychological evaluations that might help them understand his current state of mind?
It sounds like they have a huge responsibility trying to predict what someone might do in the future,
Right.
especially someone who did such awful things in the past.
It is. And it's not easy. There's no way to predict human behavior perfectly. No matter how much we try to assess things, there's always a chance that we could get it wrong.
It makes you wonder if we can ever really know for sure if someone is truly rehabilitated, if they'll ever be safe to be around other people.
That's a really deep question, one that's been debated for ages.
Right.
Is it through punishment that someone finds redemption? Or is it remorse? Or changing their actions? Or is it something that's just offered freely no matter what we've done? Those are really big questions about human nature and morality and forgiveness.
Yeah, questions that go way beyond this case.
Right.
But I think they're really important to keep in mind, especially when we're dealing with such a complicated situation where the lines between justice and mercy are so blurry.
And as we think about those questions, we can't forget about the victims.
Right, their families.
And their families. They deserve our support and empathy. And we have to keep trying to find justice and healing for them. Absolutely. Their stories are really powerful reminders that justice isn't just about punishing the person who did wrong, but also about supporting those who are hurt and working to prevent these things from happening again.
Now, we've explored both sides, the arguments for and against releasing Willie Ben Jones.
Right.
But there's one part of this case that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the fact that he almost got away with Priscilla Leaper's murder.
That's right.
What can we learn from that? From the fact that he confessed and then they just let him go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting part of this case. It shows just how complex and sometimes imperfect the criminal justice system can be.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's like something out of a movie.
It is. He confesses, walks free, and then confesses again.
It's wild. What do you think his motivation was for doing that?
It's really hard to say for sure. Maybe he was feeling guilty, or maybe he just needed to get it off his chest, even if it meant he might go to prison. Or maybe deep down he wanted to get caught. Maybe he needed to face the consequences of his actions. The human mind is complicated, full of contradictions.
It really is. And in this case, it led to him finally being caught, and at least 3 of his victims got some measure of justice.
Yeah.
But the fact is, he almost got away with murder.
It's a reminder that sometimes things fall through the cracks,
Right.
and that mistakes can happen. And sadly, some cases may never truly be closed. But it also shows us that we need to keep working to improve the system,
Right.
to learn from our mistakes and try to make things more fair and equitable for everyone.
Absolutely. We need a system that truly serves everyone in society.
Exactly.
It's a sobering thought. Justice isn't always a straight line, and it's important to remember that.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think.
It does. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, let's think about what happens next. Willie Ben Jones is scheduled to be released in December 2025. What are the different things that could happen, and what will ultimately decide his fate?
Well, as we've talked about, the parole board is in charge of that decision.
Right.
They're going to look at everything we've talked about, how he's been acting in prison, if he's done any programs, does he seem sorry,
Right.
how much of a danger does he pose to the community, how will his release affect the families of his victims?
It's a big decision with a lot of potential consequences,
It is.
both for him and for the community he might be released into.
Yeah, it's a decision where they have to balance public safety with the principles of justice and the hope that people can change.
So what can we do as individuals, as a society,
Yeah.
to prepare for the possibility that Willie Ben Jones might be coming back to our communities?
That's a really important question, and one that needs careful thought and open discussion.
This whole situation feels like we're at a crossroads.
It does.
Willie Ben Jones might be getting out, and we have to face these really tough questions about justice,
Yeah.
forgiveness, second chances. Can someone like that really change?
It really makes you think about human nature, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's that part of us that wants him to stay locked up, you know, to pay for what he did.
Right.
But then there's the other side, the idea that people can turn their lives around.
But how do we deal with those feelings, those conflicting emotions,
Yeah.
especially knowing that there's no way to predict what someone will do?
It's tough. I think the first thing is just admitting how complicated this is.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers here. This isn't a simple situation. We have to be willing to think about things from different angles, even if those perspectives make us uncomfortable.
So how do we do that? How do we get ready for the possibility that Willie Ben Jones might be back in society?
Well, I think as a society, we have to start being honest with ourselves
About.
about the limitations of the justice system,
Yeah.
how effective our programs are, if there are even enough resources to help people who are getting out of prison and the communities they're going back to.
So we have to realize that this isn't just about one person, it's about all of us. And we need to work together to create systems that hold people accountable, but also give them a chance to make things right.
Right. And I think as individuals, we need to educate ourselves, really think about these issues, talk to our families and friends about it,
Yeah.
and look at our own biases, our own assumptions about crime and punishment and what it means to rehabilitate someone.
Going through this case with you, I'm realizing how much I didn't understand about how the justice system works.
It's complicated.
It is. It's so easy to form opinions based on what you see in the news or on social media, but this deep dive has really pushed me to think more critically and consider different points of view.
I think that's the benefit of really digging into something, right?
Yeah,
You move past those simple explanations and start to see all the nuances.
absolutely. So, as we finish up, what are the most important things you think our listeners should take away from all of this?
Well, like we've been saying, there are no easy answers here.
Right.
This case forces us to think about what punishment really means. Can people really change? And what is our responsibility in creating a society that's both just and kind?
We have to find that balance
We do.
between holding people accountable for their actions and giving them a chance to become better people.
And we need to remember that it's not just about the individual, it's about fixing the systems that lead to crime and marginalization in the first place.
It's a good reminder that justice isn't just about punishment.
Right.
It's about making things whole again, helping people heal,
Right.
and working towards a society where everyone feels safe and has the opportunity to live a good life.
Yeah, I think that's something we should all be striving for, even when it seems impossible.
Well said. And to everyone listening, I encourage you to keep learning about this case.
Yeah.
Do your own research, talk to people, and really challenge your own beliefs about crime and punishment.
This is just a starting point.
Right, the real work begins when you start digging deeper on your own.
And as you do, remember to be empathetic, to really listen to what others have to say, and to be open to learning.
And remember that building a world that's both just and compassionate, that's what we should all be working towards.
I agree.
This has been a really amazing deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, stay curious, keep asking the tough questions, and keep diving deep.